for joining, and welcome to the AWSN National Webinar on today, the 17th of November 2020. Topic, let's talk about ransomware. Now, before we do get started, there are a couple of housekeeping items I just need to go through. First one, just letting everyone know that this session is being recorded. And if we can move to the next slides, thanks, Jackie. Code of conduct, all AWSN events present opportunities for all attendees to learn, share knowledge and network. We are dedicated to creating a safe, enjoyable and inclusive environment for everyone, irrespective of gender, age, ethnicity, sexual identity, religion, disability, socioeconomic background and physical appearance. Unacceptable behaviour, including harassment or abuse, will not be tolerated. To report an issue, please email board@awsn.org.au. So today's today's webinar topic is Let's Talk About Ransomware. So for most of us, 2020 will not be the year we look back upon favourably, whereas for the growing ransomware industry, it would seem the sun has been shining brightly and oh boy, have they been busy making hay. We are witnessing a veritable explosion in the number of attacks reported, the level of impact felt, the size of the ransom demands themselves, and the percentage of organisations actually paying up. So what exactly do we think is going on here? This webinar will be an entertaining and hopefully educational trip through the story of ransomware, see where it came from, how it's evolved and why, how far it has come, and where it may be headed next. Armed with this information, we can have a meaningful and pragmatic discussion about what can be done to protect ourselves and how best to respond if all else fails. So I'd like now just to introduce Eric Pinkerton. So Eric has been breaking things just to fix them since before he could walk. At 20, he spent his summer evenings as a nightclub bouncer and read tarot cards during the day. He didn't realize it back then, but nothing could have prepared him better for a career in information security, trying to predict the future while ducking the punches. Eric has been nominated as an AWSN Champion of Change, a role we acknowledge as women's careers are often supported by men in our networks. And in addition to this insightful topic on ransomware, AWSN looks to provide a variety of speakers so we can all learn from different speaking styles and techniques. Eric is a wonderfully entertaining speaker, a non-professional in the security industry, and brings a unique storytelling style to his presentations. So over to you, Eric.
Hey, thank you for that wonderful introduction and for putting pressure on me to be entertaining. So who am I? You've already had the introduction, so I won't dwell too much. My colleagues know me as Pinky. I'm an old guy in the InfoSec world. I've been doing this for roughly about 22 years, I think. I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn. I am usually the one who's trying to make controversial points or trying to stir the pot up a little bit. So let's go, let's jump straight in. So in the beginning, so when was the beginning? If we talk about ransomware, really, the first notable incident was back in 1989. And what happened in 1989 was this young chap here, it's a guy called Joseph Popp. He was a Harvard-educated evolutionary biologist, and his bright idea was to send out 20,000 infected floppy drives to the delegates of the World Health Organization's conference on AIDS. Popp was working on AIDS research at the time, so he was a delegate at the conference. And those delegates who received Popp's floppy drive, and we're talking about floppy drives in 1989, so the old 5 1/4 floppy, those who inserted that floppy drive into their IBM PC were infected by what was known as the AIDS Trojan or PC Cyborg. It was a pretty janky piece of code. It modified the autoexec.bat file, and with each reboot, it decremented a counter, and when that basically happened 90 times, it encrypted the file allocation table. You got a screen that looked something like this, and essentially the proposition was that in order to recover your data, you had to post a purchase order you had to post a $189 to a PO box in Panama. Now, Pop may well have been an awesome evolutionary biologist, but malware and coding wasn't his thing. It's very, the details are a little bit sketchy now, but it's very unlikely that he recouped anything like the cost it would have taken to mail 20,000 floppy drives out to people. He claimed that his plan was to donate the proceeds that he made to AIDS research. His OPSEC was pretty shocking, and he was summarily arrested in the US. He was extradited to the UK to face charges. But when he arrived in London, he began exhibiting really weird behavior. He basically put condoms on his nose, a cardboard box on his head, and curlers in his beard, and insisted that that was to ward off the threat of radiation. Which reminds me of this chap. If you're a POM like me, you'll recognise. It's a kind of it's a nod to Joseph Heller in the Catch-22. The Brits just got fed up of these antics, assumed that he was just absolutely bonkers, and sent him back to the US, where he basically got away scot-free. Sad ending was that Joseph Pop died in a car crash in 2008, so he never really got to see his kind of wonderful creation reach its full potential. There was a subsequent white paper by the IEEE where some academics pulled apart what he did, and their conclusion was that the flaw in his plan was his reliance on symmetric cryptography, and had he used asymmetric cryptography, it would have been a much more effective attack. Because he used symmetric encryption, it was very easy to write a piece of software to recover the files, and what happened is there was a bunch of files that did the rounds to recover your data. I also think that the main problem was the mechanism by which he was trying to organize payment, and the lead time, even in 1989, the lead time to actually mail a check to a PO box in Panama and then have a key mailed back to you was just not really something people were willing to put up with. In the subsequent years from this sort of 1989, we see a smattering of other attempts to this, all of which fail massively. But in this same time period, what we're seeing is the invention of cryptocurrency that eventually takes hold with Bitcoin. In about 2009, we start to see the first kind of the public getting their head around the concept of Bitcoin. We see this chap pays 10,000 Bitcoin for a couple of pizzas in 2010. And of course, then we see that Bitcoin's true calling come to light with the invention of the Silk Road. And basically what happens is these two wonderful worlds collide in September the 5th, 2013, which is where we see CryptoLocker. And CryptoLocker was the first ransomware that really worked. It used public key encryption. It used AES and RSA private keys. The keys were stored on the criminal's infrastructure, so it was nigh on impossible to get away with recovering without making that payment. And this, if you worked in this industry, will have been a sort of a real memory that you'll never shake off, because it literally was as if everyone you knew woke up to that day with that screen on their PCs. We don't know the percentage of people that paid, or even how many people were sort of infected with this. A survey by the University of Kent said 41% of those who claimed to be victims said that they decided to pay the ransom. It was about $200, but from memory, a pop. A lot of other organizations estimated that was probably around 3% or 4% of victims had paid. I think that all of those numbers are completely made up. But regardless, it was definitely a success. The crew behind it had to adjust the price for decryption from about 2 Bitcoin down to 0.3 Bitcoin, because the price fluctuation in Bitcoin itself that came about through people rushing to buy Bitcoin for the first time in order to pay the ransom meant that the actual cost of the ransom was varying wildly. And for some time after that, the cost of Bitcoin, or the price, the exchange rate of Bitcoin, was used to actually measure the prevalence of ransomware attacks. It's thought that the rough calculations that people have done are that this netted them around $3 million US. We don't really know for sure who they were, but a popular theory is this chap, Evgeny Bogachev, because he was the guy behind the Game Over Zeus, which was a banking Trojan, and that was used to distribute a lot of this crypto locker malware. He's thought to be living in Russia still. He has ties to the Evil Corp, who were the Drydex group, who I'll talk about a little bit later. And he has a $3 million bounty on his head, kind of ironically. So then what we see over those from 2013 onwards, we start to see ransomware take hold. By 2000, so we think about $3 million were netted in 2013. By 2015, the ransomware cost was accepted to be was estimated to be 325 million. By 2016, this was estimated at $1 billion. So we see this curve really taking off. 2016, Citrix reported that a third of British companies were actually stockpiling Bitcoin in anticipation of making a ransom payment. 2017, obviously, we saw the WannaCry attack blamed on the North Koreans, cost UK hospitals about £100 million, massive disruption to patient care, 19,000 appointments were cancelled, including operations. A third of UK hospitals were basically offline for a short while. Obviously, that was not a standard Common Garden ransomware attack. And obviously, you know, the end game wasn't really about money, or so it's thought now. It was more of a sort of political statement. By 2018, the Atlanta city government apparently spent $17 million recovering from attack. The ransom of that attack was $52,000. In 2019, Baltimore City spends over $18 million recovering from an attack where the ransom was $76,000. And in that same year, Norsk Hydro supposedly spent $85 million recovering. So now we start to see the news stories that position the idea of the cost of recovery being several orders of magnitude higher than the cost of the ransom, which is what starts cementing the idea in people's heads. Is it just cheaper for me to pay the ransom than it is to try to recover? Around about this time, we start seeing people putting their necks on the line and saying that ransomware was going to be on the wane, that the zenith of ransomware had passed. And this was largely because following the news that ensued from the WannaCry attack, it was on everyone's radar. And what everyone did was go out and invest heavily in good backups. And the backup organizations, companies selling backup solutions, did really well in sort of 2017, 2018, 2019. You see that their share prices go through the roof. 2020, the story is that the average ransom is reported is $84,000. Although that's a kind of nonsense number because it's a medium and it goes from $200 right up to 15 million. In one case, there was talk of a ransom being $1 billion, which I'll come to. Also this year, there was for the first time, there was a ransomware attack in Germany on the Dusseldorf University Hospital, which meant that they were unable to give a patient care in their intensive care unit, and they transferred the patient 19 miles to another hospital, and during that journey, the patient passed away. So we have the first direct link between ransomware and actual, the death of a patient. Although, in fairness, I think the WannaCry attack and the impact that had on the health service in the UK probably resulted in hundreds of, if not thousands of deaths that would have been sooner had that incident not happened, or operations not being deferred or cancelled, or appointments being cancelled. But that was more abstracted from this. This was a very tangible linked event. So paying the ransom, obviously, I talked about that. It seems in these cases, or looking at these case studies, that paying the ransom is a cheapest option, because it cuts down the need to pay overtime to employees being engaged to recover that data. It saves the need to pay for public relations effort to deal with the aftermath of this. And there are anecdotal cases where insurance companies have insisted that companies pay the ransom. And I think that's kind of interesting. Firstly, it's a false dichotomy. You don't get to choose between either paying the ransom and recovering or recovering the data. If you do end up going down the route of paying the ransom, then the first thing you have to do is quickly try to lift your cybersecurity posture. You need to understand how they were able to compromise you and gain a foothold. You need to clean up. You probably want to restore data rather than doing a recovery through their means, because you want to make sure that you've evicted the attacker. That's what costs the money. That's what's difficult. And also, what you start to see is there are a couple of cases, most notably in Australia was the Toll case, where an organization is attacked, and then within months, organization is re-attacked by a different crew asking for another ransom, which is obviously the common theme is with ransomware. If you pay, you're sending a signal to everyone else that you're good to pay, that you've got insurance or whatever, and you're sort of putting a target on your back. So it's important not to consider the idea of payment to be a dichotomous. It's either we pay or we recover. You pretty much need to do both. 2019, at the very end of the year, we start to see the first cases of what we now refer to as double extortion. This was piloted by the Maze Group. So essentially the proposition went from, if you pay us, we will give you the key to recover your data. And pretty much in October, we saw the first cases of this, and then everyone else switched to this model where now they say, we've encrypted your data, we've also exfiltrated your data. Here's a screenshot of all the data we've stolen. If you want the key to recover your data, it's going to cost you this much money. And if you don't pay us, we're going to release all of this data either for auction on the dark web, or we're just going to dump it on Mega. And you'll have journalists picking through your dirty laundry. You'll have all your competitors looking at your data, and so on and so forth. And this is what's led to this increase in stories of people paying the ransom. So let's look at the wonderful year of 2020. If you remember New Year's Eve 2020, how bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and young we all looked before this year. And then this is what, these are the attacks I know of that impacted Australian and New Zealand in 2020. So these aren't all Australian or New Zealand companies, but they're companies that have a large either footprint in Australia, or they have a large staff base in Australia, or they have lots of Australians. For instance, Garmin have lots of Australian customers that weren't able to use their watches or their GPS devices for a short while. So there's about 30 attacks, and some of these are, might be a little bit subjective. So for instance, Mattel, obviously they're not based in Australia, but if we start to see them unable to make toys as a result of this, it might mean that Australian children don't get the Christmas present they necessarily wanted come Christmas time. This ILG is an organization, I only just added this icon in the last 10 minutes to the slide deck because I was having a look at one of the leak sites and this came up. It's a company that sells wholesale liquor. I think it's International Liquor Group, but it's a Melbourne-based organization. This list I'm updating probably twice a week because new cases come to light. Companies are publishing their annual reports and are releasing for the first time information that they've been ransomed. The organizations you see with a red border around them are the organizations where there is some anecdotal information, or we can see from the breach site, or we've read there are sort of public domain stories that they have paid the ransom. Obviously, there's a lot more organizations that have paid the ransom that we don't know whether or not they've paid the ransom. Typically, when an organization now gets compromised, their information goes onto a leak site and journalists are picking over that information, and we'll see that the company has been attacked. They will see what the demand is and when the demand is due. They will be able to see from looking at that website whether that data subsequently gets published by the attackers, which is a real indicator on whether they've paid the ransom or not. And the attackers are getting more and more wise to this and have now, some of them have separate parts of their website. So that you don't know an organization, it's not in the public domain that the organization has been compromised until negotiations break down and they don't meet a deadline and pay up. So only then that it becomes public knowledge that the organization's been compromised. A little case study. Lion Group was a very well-known one in Australia because we all like our drinks. Very quick case. 8th of June was the first cyber attack. The systems were summarily shut down. They made an announcement on the 9th of June and apologized for the disruption. By the 10th, they pretty much admitted to using paper and pencil manual systems. Their dairy and drinks business was offline. Critical aspects of their brewing was offline. They made an announcement on the 12th that there's no evidence of any of the information contained in our systems, including financial or personal information, had been affected, which was a pretty bold statement given that they were attacked by the Revel group, who have a leak site that displayed screenshots of all the information that had been stolen. On the 14th of June, they claimed there was a second attack, and it's not that clear whether this was the same attacker or a different attacker, or it was the initial attacker kind of upping the ante by compromising additional systems. But at this point, we hear that the ransom for $800,000 was demanded. Now, for the Revel crew, that's really low, and it's possible that they didn't really understand the size of this. If this is a sort of $5 billion organization, 5.6 revenue back in 2015, which were the numbers I could find. Now, often when these attackers compromise an organization, they will spend as long as a month inside that organization retrieving information, and they will know exactly what the turnover of that organization is. They will know what the insurance policies that organization has invoked, and they will use that to inform the amount of the ransom that they put forward. And it's quite interesting that I've seen negotiations with organizations where the organization has said, we can't possibly pay that much. And the attackers have come back and say, yes, you can, you've got insurance. And the customer has said, well, no, we haven't got insurance. And the attackers have said, well, yes, you have got insurance. Here's a screenshot of or here's the PDF document with your insurance clauses on it. So they're very well informed about what their targets are doing. They don't simply go in and drop malware immediately and encrypt the drive. They're spending, between 2 weeks and a month in the organization, really profiling and understanding it. So long story short, it's about 18 days from start to finish, from the initial attack to them getting their business back online and being able to satisfy those deliveries, which is right in the pocket for the average. The average is about 19 days of downtime that's caused by one of these attacks. Final statement, public statement, we still have no evidence of any data being removed. That's a screenshot from Happy Blog with all of the folders that the attackers claimed. Now, interestingly, Revel didn't or haven't as yet published this information. This is going back to June. So to me, it's an odd sign that the information hasn't been published, which either leads me to believe that perhaps a negotiation was made and a ransom or a portion of the ransom was paid, or it means that these folders actually contained encrypted information. So whilst we have a folder structure, the information may already have been encrypted, perhaps by the first attacker or perhaps by some sort of file encryption system, and the attackers were simply unable in this case to release that data. I don't know for sure. I'd be interested if anyone's got any scuttlebutt on that to know. CAMPARI is a much more recent case. This happened in November. It's kind of interesting. So it happened on the 1st of November, the attack took place. They acknowledged the attack and said that they're going to restore from backup by the 3rd of November. On the 6th of November, they make a statement that says we can't exclude the fact that personal information has been taken. the weird thing is that there's then this communication between the attackers and CAMPARI, where the attackers are urging CAMPARI to pay and saying, we have all of this information, we're going to publish it. CAMPARI are not responsive. So the attackers compromise some chap in the US who's a DJ on Facebook and use his Facebook account to serve ads targeted at CAMPARI execs, urging them to pay up, which is quite interesting. 10th of November, the timer expires, and the 13th of November, all of those details get published. This was Ragnar, the crew, and essentially all of CAMPARI's global address book, all of their files are now sitting on the dark web, which is, this was on the 13th of November, so super fresh. Some stats by a crew in Singapore called Dark Tracer. They have collected or collated I think 835 at the moment attacks by 18 prominent actors, and I did some analysis of this to see who was the most prolific, and what you see is by far the most prolific crew is Maze. Now Maze is interesting because they pretty much went dark in July this year, so they are still sort of 30% of this pie. However, they haven't been doing anything since about July. And interestingly, on the 1st of November this month, they announced that they were quitting after completely being quiet for all this time. So what you're now finding is the affiliates who used to work for Maze are now moving off to other crews, and other crews' stats are growing with that expertise onboarded. More than 50% of the attacks we see are coming via remote desktop protocol, so RDP, so exposed RDP. And essentially what we're seeing is the main vectors of attack are phishing. So either phishing to steal credentials, which are then subsequently used for either exposed services like RDP or VPN services, or they're using common exploits to compromise those to exposed footprint. So they're using core impact and sort of pen testing tools, or they will send attachments via email. So they'll send Word documents loaded with macros and so on and so forth. So not super effective, not super, what's the word, sophisticated, all stuff that you can fix with Essential A or common, good hygiene, good patching, and so on and so forth. But they're being very effective with that. Why is this happening? I think there's a bunch of things have come to happen this year. Obviously, we've seen a big increase in unemployment globally. That's led to some collective boredom, which has led to some people stuck at home. And, there is this, it works very similar to a bug bounty. You can do this from anywhere. They're advertising for people on sort of hacking forums for people to go and do the heavy lifting of this work. They will compromise the organization, and they're looking for people who will then go and do that, collect the files, escalate your privileges, deploy the ransomware, and so on and so forth, whereas they will handle all of the negotiations and so on and so forth. I think also an awful lot of these criminals had substantial holdings in cryptocurrencies, and as coronavirus hit, the cryptocurrencies kind of started to drop, and a lot of them, I think, thought all of my net worth is now being devalued, so therefore I need to double down and I need to invest more in my business. And the other thing you've seen is the initial successful attacks have led to them being able to have money to up their skills, up their capabilities. They're driving around in sports cars. Other kids are looking at them and wanting to know what they do and how they do it, and are following in their footsteps. So that's the question, should we pay? So common question I get. Obviously, the answer is no, never pay, do not pay, do not pay. However, it's very easy for me as a consultant to make glib statements like you should never pay. Many organizations are faced with the reality in an incident like this that the option they have is either they pay or they go out of business. And so it's unhelpful to just parrot some government advisory that says you should not pay for the greater good. The only people who can really answer that question is the senior execs of an organization that is on the receiving end of such a demand. We're told that at the moment, you know, there's various statistics, but we're told about 1 in 3 organizations are paying at the moment. I think a lot of the canon rhetoric about do not pay was written in the days that crypto malware was just about recovering data. And now we've got this double extortion threat. What we're finding is organizations pay sometimes because their backups are online and they got encrypted so they cannot restore from backup. Their backups are insufficient, so they're incomplete or they're out of date, or often both. Perhaps they've done the math and they've actually calculated that recovery by key is cheaper than recovering by backup in terms of the resources that it would take and the time it would take to do it. And often they're paying for the promise that their data will be deleted by the attackers. And of course, there is no guarantee that if you pay the ransom, the attackers will follow through on their promises to delete your data and will not come after you again for more money. This is extortion after all, they're criminals. There's no honor amongst thieves. And we've started to see stories of some attackers actually coming back for a second bite of the pie. So Sobanobki or Revel apparently has re-extorted victims after they've paid that ransom. The next question that comes up is around if it's even legal to pay in Australia. So what we have in Australia is something called the Criminal Code Act of 1995, which is Commonwealth law, which says it is a serious criminal offence if a person deals with money or property where there's a risk that money or property will become an instrument of crime. And I'm not a lawyer, but essentially what they're saying is if you give money to a criminal and that there is a reasonable expectation that that criminal will use that money in the commission of more crimes, which is a fair assumption in ransomware, where they're going to take your ransom and use it to incentivize other attackers or up their capabilities or finance the business of extorting other people, then you're committing a serious offense. However, what there is the defense of duress, which is where the attackers are basically threatening to release your information on the dark web, and that's going to harm your customers or harm your business. Then you have that defense of duress. And furthermore, this law has never been tested in Australia. I think you'd be very unlucky to fall foul of this. So I don't think that is a serious impediment to paying. But again, I'm not a lawyer. I talked about leak sites, so I thought it'd be interesting to have a quick shufty at some of those. This is Ragnar. These are the guys that took down Carlson Wagon Travel. They're relatively easy to find. Most of them are on the dark web. If you go looking, I think they are quite interesting to look at. They're very fascinating in terms of the language that they use and the way they describe what they do. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that you need to look at these sites to see if you're on there, or certainly don't pay organizations to do threat intelligence to look on these sites for you, because if you are a victim of ransomware, you will know about it long before it appears on one of these sites, because the whole way that the scam works is that you have to know that there's a threat before you're going to pay your ransom. Also, the Australian, the ACSC will almost certainly reach out to you, because I know they monitor these sites and they reach out to you. And I'm not even sure why the ACSC reaches out to organizations to let them know that they're on these sites, because I think there's a zero probability that organizations do not know that they've been ransomware, with the possible exception that there are some cases where IT people have swept it under the carpet in the hope it will go away. I think more what they want to do is get in touch with organizations to offer them the resources that they have at their disposal to assist, but also to get a seat at the table so that they can really push the idea that you shouldn't pay the ransom. So it's very much in the government's interest to convince organizations not to make a payment, or to absolutely not make payments seem like an easy option for obvious reasons. This is Clop Leaks. This is Happy Blog. Interestingly, I had a look at Happy Blog earlier today, and the two companies that are on there are both Australian organizations. So this really is an issue that's affecting Australians at the moment. This is Doppler. This is Maze, who've now gone quiet as of the 1st of November. So this is their website. Maze were the first to set up a breach site, then started offering their services to other crews. So they started publishing things for other crews before just suddenly cashing out and going dark. Now, I don't know whether these guys are all sitting on a beach somewhere in sort of drinking cocktails, or whether these guys have been assassinated, or whether they've been co-opted by organized crime. I really don't know what's going on there, and it's doubtful we'll ever find out, but it's certainly kind of interesting. This is a guy called Maxim Yakubets. He is the young guy who's being given a very gentle admonishment by a police officer for doing donuts outside the police station in Moscow in his camo decaled Lamborghini. These are the guys behind Evil Corp. So Evil Corp was also the guy, encompasses the guy that we think was behind CryptoLocker originally, Bogachev. Now these guys are, this guy's wife is the daughter of a guy who is very high up in the Russian GRU. The theory is that she's also a GRU operative. The GRU is the sort of Russian equivalent of the CIA. And he is considered to be untouchable because of his ties into Russian government. These are the guys that extorted Garmin and took down Garmin's cloud services, which meant that it was impossible for people to update their watch face on their new smartwatch, and apparently got paid $10 million. Now, the interesting thing about Evil Corp is that they were placed under sanctions by the US Treasury in December, which made paying the ransom very difficult for Garmin, being an American company. So the story is that they shopped around to try and find a ransomware negotiation company, of which there are a few. And it looks like they approached a company called Arret IT, who declined to work with them over fears of breaking those sanctions. And they eventually found an organization called Coveware, who somehow managed to step in and broker that deal. My guess is they didn't pay the full $10 million of that ransom. But I'm assuming they have all sorts of shell accounts in the Caymans, or the ability to pay this and go around get around those sanctions. Coveware's entire business model seems to be, we will negotiate with the attackers for you, we'll haggle over the price, we'll buy the Bitcoin, and then we'll help you decrypt your data when we get the key. It's kind of an interesting view on how successful ransomware is, that there are businesses that are purely trading off the back of it. There's a couple of other businesses that are interesting that claim to help with ransomware, a company called Proven Data and Monster Cloud, both in the US, and they claim to be able to recover your data using the latest technology. And essentially, for anyone who understands cryptography and how this works, will know that the latest technology is a bit of a stretch. And essentially what they were doing was charging more for their services than the cost of the ransom. Then they were negotiating for the key with the attackers, paying the ransom, getting the key, and pretended that they'd recovered the data through electro-magical means. And everyone was happy because the companies weren't financing criminals, and these two organizations were making a mozza in the middle. When it came to light, that's what they were doing. It kind of, I imagine their business sort of dried up a little bit. So yeah, this is Jakubet and his collection of cars, which I'm sure provide a beautiful incentive to other would-be criminals in that part of the world. This is a bit of a case study around Carlson Wagon-Lit Travel versus Ragnar. Carlson were attacked. They then left the helpful chat dialogue on the leak site for a few days, which meant somebody captured screenshots of it and then published them on Twitter. And what's interesting, I won't read all this out to you, but what's interesting is there is this very cordial, collegiate conversation between the attackers and between the what they call their customer, talking essentially about, you've told us this is $8 million, we can't afford $8 million, you've told us if we contact you soon we'll get a special price. That's not the special price. The price goes down from $8 to something like $4 mil. And then finally what we get is this final piece, which is a list of recommendations to avoid this in future. And this is the attackers telling Carlson, this is what you need to do to stop us ever coming, being able to attack you again, which is interesting because essentially what they're doing is, this is essentially at 4.2 million US, the most expensive pen test in the history of the world. And it's kind of some of the things that we might recommend as a security consultant, with the obvious exception is I would never tell someone to update their passwords every month because they'd probably flat out punch me in the face. And this nice bit at the end, which is for big companies, we suggest 3 system admins working 24/7, 4 admins, 3 shifts, 8 hours a day. Essentially what they're talking about is manage, detect, respond, or a managed SOC solution or an inside SOC, which I thought was kind of interesting. Lovely pat on the back for everyone concerned. It's a pleasure to work with professionals. If you have any questions, we will leave the information on their chat in case you need it, and so on and so forth. Next, Kate, how are we doing for time? Oh, I'm going to forge on. So next case study was Tesla. So in August, we start to see the details emerge of this. It was a botched job on Tesla. And according to the FBI filing, which is a great read, this chap here, his name is Igor Igorovich Krukovich. He's 27, good-looking rooster, Russian citizen. He was arrested trying to bribe a Tesla employee with between $500,000 and $1 million in Bitcoin into assisting with the ransomware attack, which was purportedly designed to yield $1 billion ransom. There's this interesting part in the filing where they talk about a plan to actually execute a DDoS attack whilst the employee was planting the ransomware, which is the first time I've ever heard about this happening in the real world outside of an academic paper where they always assert that a DDoS attack always means it's a misdirection for something else that's happening. I've never seen that happen in the real world, but this was supposedly the plan, which might imply that these guys were complete amateurs and didn't really know what they were doing. They got caught the first time. Igor's sitting in a cell waiting on a charge. And my advice to him, if he's listening, is to pop a condom on your nose and a box on your head, grow a beard and put some curlers in it, and explain that it's for the radiation, and you might be home in time for Christmas. So what do we do from here? Or what do I expect to see from here? So I think we're going to see obviously more attacks. They're going to get more sophisticated. The more organizations that pay, the more money goes into those organizations, the more they upskill, the more they get better tools, the more they get more capable, and the more they're likely to go after more mature targets. We're going to hear more news about people, companies paying, and we're going to definitely see this continued trend of ransom demands getting bigger. I think what's happening is people are getting used to negotiating the ransom demand right down. So in response, the attackers are aiming higher and higher and higher. And we're starting to see, it's now common to see ransomware demands sort of 8 mil, 9 mil, 10 mil kind of area, rather than just, maybe even 6 months ago, we were talking about $1 million. Attackers are gaining in aggression, so they're becoming more and more aggressive. They're resorting to new innovative ways to get people to pay. I read the other day that there was an attacker who paid an Indian call center to repeatedly phone their victims to ask them when they were going to pay, almost like a harassment campaign. And as I talked about earlier, there was the Facebook ad campaign. We're going to, I think, hear more talks about the threat of insiders being bribed, because if we do go and get the technology sorted such that ransomware is very difficult to deploy, then the logical, easiest path to do that is to bribe an insider to plant some ransomware internally. And if we're talking about billion-dollar ransoms, why wouldn't you place someone in a job, and go for that long con? I think it's a chance we'll see more IoT or smart devices affected by this, because that was it seemed to be a very elegant way to make the organization pay up very quickly. I think we'll see insurance companies changing their language around making payments or finding ways to weasel out of having to make payments for ransomware. I think we'll start to see more suggestions of ties into foreign governments or organized crime. We're likely to see FBI takedowns of crews or sanctions against them. We'll see turf wars, we'll see amalgamation. And I still think that there is probably a opportunity, if not already, for organized crime to move in on this territory, because this is a lot more profitable and a lot easier than traditional organized crime like drug running and so on and so forth. If there are takedowns or that happens, then the vacuum is going to be quickly filled by even more aggressive and less honorable attackers, as we saw in the sort of AV industry. Final slide. So what do we do? First thing is please, please, please do not let this be you. So it's much better to prepare and to prevent this happening than it is to respond to this. A good way to do that is to use something like the NIST CSF to ensure that all your bases are covered. So a comprehensive strategy, multi-factor auth on everything. Never, 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 never expose RDP. Anyone who argues that it is possible to expose RDP and do it securely, they're completely right, but it is such a difficult thing to do that I don't think there's any real sound rationale for doing it. It's usually a lazy solution. Patch and scan your public IP regularly, or sign up to Showdown and have a look at what the internet can see for known vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. Look at the delta between scans. So every time something changes in your environment, either because a new vulnerability has been dropped or because someone else has spun up a new box that's exposed to the internet, make sure you're focusing on that. Use a secure email gateway, so a third party who can scan your inbound mail and outbound mail to look for anything dodgy, so using things like sandboxing and so on and so forth. Continual awareness training, get an IR team or an IR retainer service, so if this does happen, you can get some instant response happening very quickly because you'll have a very short time to respond. Get good offline backups. Remember that backup isn't the silver bullet anymore, but there's more than a few cases where I've seen organizations whose online backups have also been encrypted. 2, have a crisis management plan for this and drill it. So that is to say, have a plan and actually do some tabletop exercises or run-throughs to make sure people know where it is and iron out any bugs before you need to use it in anger. Decide early on if payment is an option, who can make that call and how that happens. Don't pay, but if you must negotiate, then negotiate hard and be courteous and professional with the attackers, otherwise they will think nothing of burning you. Have a communications plan in place, so pre-can statements, understand the nuances around good and bad comms, especially in the light of the fact that a lot of this information may well subsequently be published on the dark web, which means any statements you make will be held to account. So if you say, as people have done, we are confident that no information has been stolen, and then stolen information promptly appears on the dark web, it's not going to be a good look. So you need to be honest. Get insurance, check your cover before you need it, and then check it again. You could always ask your favorite security consultant for a ransomware readiness assessment or something like that to kind of help understanding how well you are prepared, both from a defensive and prevention perspective, but also in terms of if the worst happens, how you're able to respond to something like that. Last throwaway suggestion is my suggestion to update the NIST cybersecurity framework to add on revenge. Simulate remorse in your attackers by giving them a terrible sob story so they feel bad for you. Report any of their tools, techniques, IOCs, and burn their tools just to make it more costly for them. Hack back, obviously don't hack back unless you really know what you're doing. Deception technology, so things like honeypots are a really good way, or canary tools are a really good way to pick up someone in your organization trying to move laterally or trying to do reconnaissance. So that might give you a couple of days heads up that something's happening. And collaborate with your peers, share your knowledge, and just anything that you can do to increase the sort of cost to the attackers is good. There we go.
Awesome.